Welcome to the Revolution Church podcast.
Anyway, good morning. How's it going, everybody? Hope you all had a pleasant weekend. Sorry, for some reason it's not letting me do the movie view, so we'll just stick with this for now. So last week was tough. Lost a good man. My good friend Steve has passed away. He had cancer, and yeah, so we're going to talk a little bit about Steve today, but we're going to do it in a really roundabout way. So we're going to go on a journey, if you will. It was strange that Josh was filling in for me, because I had a friend from out of town, and wasn't able to get to the talk, and I didn't realize I would also be kind of like mourning my good friend Steve. And so Steve was very special, and I think the only way for me to explain to you why he was such a special human being in my life. I mean, he was special to the world, you know. He was special to history. He was special to the AIDS movement and the LGBTQ movement, and for being a survivor, and for the work he did with my mother. But he was very special to me as a friend, and so that's what I want to talk about. Steve Pieters today, and why his life meant so much to me. And let's see if we can grab the connections here. I grew up with learning disabilities most of my life. I grew up with dyslexia, and back in the 80s, people just thought you were lazy or didn't pay attention or whatever. And so I grew up at a school that basically my parents ran. And Heritage Academy. It was the Christian school at PTL. And before that, in first grade, actually, my parents sent me to another Christian school. And before that, I was in kindergarten. I was in public school. And I kind of wish I would have been able to stay in public school, because I got to take the bus, and that was an adventure. As a kid, I liked that. I thought that was really cool. But in first grade, I was a part of this Christian school system, and they had the PACE system, ACE, and basically the concept is everybody works at their own pace. Now, the really funny thing about this, so all the kids on the same age, I mean, it was almost kind of like a communist type thing. Everybody in the same age gets to stay in the room in the same class, but not everybody's doing the same work, because everybody might be at a different learning level. And the first grade that I went to, that was not my father's school. My parents wasn't at the Heritage Academy, was another school. First of all, they had dividers, and all the classes were in one room this first time, so it was really interesting. And so we had dividers, so these big white dividers between each thing, and so you couldn't see the student next to you, you couldn't see any students around you. You just had your little cubicle. It was like the beginning of cubicles. And you had to write a chart of your goals for the day, of what work how much you were going to get done in math, and how much you were going to get done in social studies and religious studies. And it was, very Christian stuff. And it had these little characters, ACE and AC, and he had a dog, and there's all sorts of Christian stuff thrown in there to the learning thing. But I noticed right away that my learning was slower than everybody else. And I got these like special books that they had to give me for some learning difficulties. And I remember the other kids were like, "Oh, you got special books," but I remember knowing in my mind like they weren't good. And then they realized that as they started getting books in color, that was what happened. Is your grade, the colors would change for the books, and you get better. Anyway, so around first grade, I started to know that I didn't belong. Like there was something wrong with me, as far as educational wise. And that kind of moved on, kind of continued to grow as I went into my parents' school. They realized I was struggling again. And a lot of people thought, well, he's Jim and Tammy's kid. They travel a lot. He's born with a silver spoon in his mouth, so he must just be lazy, and just not care and think he deserves everything on a silver plate. Was kind of the idea that I was getting. But it was one of those things where it was like, no, something's wrong. Like I'm not learning like everybody else is learning. I mean, ironic that I have all these books behind me now, you know. And so one of the things you learn to do is you learn coping mechanisms to deal with learning disabilities. And with my learning disability, I would learn to kind of like sweet talk teachers, or not get homework, or do certain things so I wouldn't have to like do things alone, or that I knew like, oh, when they get that person to help me with my work, I know that they'll tell me how to do it. You know what I mean? So you really learn how to like scam the system, because the system isn't, especially private schools, aren't developed to deal with people with learning disabilities. Sorry, there's always planes around here. I don't think we're close to the airport, but I always hear helicopters, so maybe we're just a lot of crime. Um, so I never felt fully accepted around like teachers and people in the system. I never felt like I was included and that there was something wrong with me, but I also had to learn how to talk to them in order to deal with this. Now, long story longer, there was things like I would play sick. I would, stay in other people's, there were therapists, Christian counselors that also worked in the same offices. So sometimes Vi, who is a friend of mine, I would go stay in her office to get out of school, because you learn to kind of manipulate these things. Given that, I would have tutors as well that I would have to meet with during school for reading and writing. And I really didn't get reading down until honestly, I don't think I really got it down until I was 11. And now it's like, I love to read, and I've loved to read for years. And my writing was impossible. It's still bad. My writing is still awful. I'm still the world's not maybe the world's worst speller, but I'm a very bad speller. And I struggled with math and things like that, and so I had to have these tutors. But when I would have these tutors, what I would end up doing was having conversations with them about life, or about my parents, or finding out what they were interested in, because it was so hard for me to study. It was so hard for me to understand a normal way of studying. Now that I've read books on dyslexia, and I mean, one of the fastest books I ever read was a book on dyslexia called My Dyslexia, and I think I read it in like 4 or 5 hours. It meant so much to me. I mean, it related so much to it, and I felt like, oh, I'm not alone in this. But how I really taught myself to read was through comic books. I loved collecting comic books, but I really wanted to know what they said. And so I kind of self-taught myself to read through kind of like trying to sound out and asking people and recognizing words and things like that. It had to be through like a passion and through a different way. It was just, for some reason, school wasn't working with me. My parents had the huge scandal, and in the 9th grade, a huge scandal, and PTL fell apart. So I ended up in another like weird no school for a while, then another private school, and then we moved to Florida, and I was in another private school, but I ended up getting kicked out of that private school. I did a talk about that once called the First Academy, not First Academy material, because my learning disabilities were still in the way. It was so it was like you felt this powerless feeling of like, well, I must be stupid because I can't learn. I promise you all, this is going somewhere. And I remember in this Florida school, they would do the reading around the classroom, and it would get to me, and it was just the most embarrassing thing because I was having to try to sound it out. It would take forever. Kids being kids would laugh and make fun of me. At this time, I at least had lost a lot of weight because I was a chubby kid too. So I mean, it was just like life was tough. So not only did I have dyslexia, I also had eating issues and all this kind of stuff. I promise this is going somewhere. So through my love of comic books, I got reading a little bit better. But I was reading to myself. Now I can speed read, which is really strange. I don't speed read philosophy books because that you don't get anything, but I can speed read like fiction books, and it's pretty cool. But this time is you feel feeling like an outcast, always feeling like an outcast, and so what you realize is you try to work towards your strengths. So style, cool clothes, cool friends. You try to like, I'm smoking cigarettes, I'm drinking to deal with the hard times, but you try to like compensate in other areas. And so when I got kicked out of the first academy, I ended up going to Dr. Phillips High School, but I went from 7th grade to 9th grade. My mom and her friend Carlene just decided, like, you know what? Jay hangs out with Bo. Bo was my best friend, and he was in high school. And she's like, let's just go sign him up. Let's just put him in. We don't even have to say anything. They won't even notice. And of course, they didn't notice until it was about 6 months into my 9th grade year, and I had to have a teacher-parent conference, which was kind of embarrassing. But 9th grade was a good year for me. I had a lot of friends in the higher classes, but then that was the first year they just did 9th graders alone across the street from the rest of the high school. So once again, it was this like, you're the odd man out. You're like, oh, you 9th grade center, and they made fun of us. And the freshman center is what they called it. And the first few months of school, I did really well with math and things. I was really surprised. Like, I was like, doing so good, but I guess it was because it was like, going over things I already knew. I did read a book called The Outsiders, and about socias and greasers in the 50s. And that, I loved that book. And I could read it to myself. I hated reading it out loud, but I would go home and I would read it to myself, and I loved that book. And I loved to, because in my class, a lot of my friends were like, are you a grease or a soc? Because I was like this like hybrid preppy punk, and I was like, oh, this is so cool. Like, the world's colliding and people are asking me things about it. Like, somehow I identify with this book, and I did identify with this book. And it was really cool. So that 9th grade, I struggled. I struggled to get through it, but I found an identity. But the weird thing was I had an identity with my punk rock friends, and then over the main campus, I had an identity with my popular friends. And so I had these two worlds, and I was trying to be like, how do I move through these two worlds and also deal with this learning disability? I'm going to jump into 10th grade then. I jump into 10th grade, and I'm lost, completely lost. They put me into learning strategy classes or special ed, and I'm taking special education classes. And I mean, I remember friends of mine going like, why are you in front of like and they would say stuff like retard classes and things like that were really cruel. And you'd be like, I'm in those classes, you know? And I was in some other normal classes as well. And I remember I was in this one science class, and I was just so lost that I would just sit there and literally look at the wall. Like, I didn't know what to do. I was full of fear. I felt like an outcast. I felt like I didn't belong. I didn't know what the work. I didn't know how to do the work. And then the teacher thought I was, I had a Hispanic teacher, and she thought I was just this like white, rich, privileged kid, and so she had a lot of resentments towards me. And that wasn't the case. Like, my dad is in prison, my mom's doing the best she can to make ends meet. I'm white, but I have learning disabilities, so I don't know how to do anything, so I don't know what to do. And I remember I tried to get the teachers to move me to another class just so I could have a nicer teacher who would maybe understand the fact that I was just completely lost. Wasn't doing homework, wasn't doing anything, to the point where they took us on a they took us on a field trip to a trade school. And So basically, when they take you to a field trip on a trade school, it's the idea of, you know, we don't, you're not going to make it in high school, and we're gonna, you know, you need to drop out. That was what they were saying. You need to drop out. You need to learn how to be a air conditioning repairman or a car mechanic. And there's nothing wrong with that, but they were just being like, there's nothing we can do for you. So my parents got divorced and my mom moved to California. I stayed in Florida for a little while, and they divorced. But why I'm telling you all this stuff is because for a lot of my life, I fought in this feeling of not belonging, this feeling of being judged by everybody. All my theology for so many years was self-taught. I did do some seminary classes because seminary in Minnesota opened up its doors to me and allowed me to take some classes, and it was just fantastic. But mostly self-taught through philosophy, through theology, scholarship. I just studied and read books and did that on my own. But for me, it was like one of those things where I still felt like I wasn't good enough, because I was around people like my best friend has, a doctorate in philosophy, other friend has a doctorate from, Princeton theology, everybody's got all this educated stuff, and I'm sitting there going, I can hold my own and have these conversations with these guys. But it's still always this feeling of like, I'm not good enough. And it plays through everything, and I think that's why these past few years have been so great for me, is embracing my mother's legacy of I've got to be me. But I still struggle to be me and to be who I am. And it's not even like you're feeling like a fraud. It's just feeling like, oh, I don't have the things that people hold important, feeling like the odd man out. And why I say all this is because I'm sure a lot of us feel this way in our own lives, is we feel like maybe we don't belong, or we feel like odd men out, odd women out, odd people out. And so, you go to the trade school, and I remember because you could smoke at the trade school, and I was like, oh, I like that part. They made us take these tests, I think altitude test or something, where you had to like learn. It would tell you what you should be. And on my test, philosopher came up. Isn't that funny? They were like, oh man, this guy's screwed because he can't. High school doesn't want him. We don't want him. Nobody wants him. So you spend your life learning to all these coping mechanisms, and I realized how they became very dysfunctional in a lot of my different relationships, because I was always trying to overcome this feeling of like insecurity and this feeling of stupidity or being not smart enough or not being ever feeling normal. Like I just never felt normal. And I had to create an image so that so it was like tattooed preacher, grace guy, and I struggle to be me. I still do. And the thing is even to this day, everyone wants you to be something else. Everybody wants you to be something that you're not. Liberals want you to follow a certain line. Conservatives want you to follow a certain line. Everybody, punk rockers think, oh, this is what punk rock is. Everybody's like, even your individual friends are like, well, this is the politics, and these are why, and you should think the way I do. Blah, blah, blah. Yeah, so everybody's got these ideas of like, we just continually, like, everybody should be like us rather than embracing the beauty of differences. I saw this quote that said, if you're the same as everybody, like if you have no differences than the other, then you really don't need the other. Like, what's the point? You're all thinking the same. You don't really even have a need for each other. And I think that's what people want. And I felt that in Christianity, And it's funny, like I even had a friend who became a humanist, and I remember talking with him, and I felt like, I totally don't even belong to you guys. Like, you guys are all like humanists and telling me all my stuff's stupid. It was just this thing of like this constant shock of how we create these tribes and these ideals of what's, most of the stuff we've all made up. We made up society. We made up all these, but we still make people outcasts, even amongst the outcasts. Like, well, I left Christianity, so I'm better than you. Or I am doing this in Christianity, so I'm better than you. You know, it's like, for the love of money, man. Think like me. It's time to get on the time machine, everybody. Now we're going to get back in the time machine and we're going to head back to 1985. I don't know if you guys aren't talking, but I don't see any comments coming up, which is fine. You can be quiet. So amazed by my trying to keep up with my bad schooling stories. So back in 85, in the 80s, the AIDS crisis was everywhere, and people were terrified of the AIDS crisis. I mean, it was like made COVID look like nothing, you know, because you saw how these people were dying. You know, we saw how these people were, these men, especially all these young gay men, you know, were just wasting away and dying from, you know, AIDS opened your body to all these diseases. So they were dying from the flu, they were dying from cancers, they were dying from all these things, they were getting sores on their face. And it was this terrifying thing. Ironically, Dr. Fauci was around at that time as well. And he kind of actually, in the beginning, created a lot of fear around AIDS. And so people were thought you could get it through saliva or maybe even in the air. Some of my friends who went through that, Steve especially, you know, like you said, like, you know, you'd go over to eat at somebody's house and they would give you a paper plate and plastic forks while they were all eating on the dishes. They didn't want to share dishes with you. They didn't want to share clothes with you, you know, much less be your lover or be there. You know, they didn't want to hold you. And that was one of the reasons why in the 80s, lesbians really became important to these gay men who were dying of AIDS. Of course, you know, straight people got AIDS too, but it was, you know, it was pushed in of people men being pushed into secret, you know, into, you know, having to meet secretly and do the, you know, and it's men who they're sexually charged and things, but it was being can't remember the word, promiscuity, somebody will tell me here, they always do. Promiscuity, yes, promiscuity, rampant. But, you know, that's what's happening. They've been pushed out of the church, they've been pushed out of place, they've been pushed into hiding. But AIDS started to go, promiscuity, thank you. You know, there was a flight attendant flying all over who had AIDS, and AIDS spread horribly. And it was a terrifying time. And it was like, I often hope that people in the LGBT community don't forget what those men were going through in the 80s. I mean, we were terrified. And so my mom said, we've got to get somebody with AIDS on here. We got to talk to somebody with AIDS. We got to look into this. And Steve Pieters is the man that they got a hold of, and he happened to be a pastor for the Metropolitan Community Church. And so you get like a triple whammy. So you don't only have just someone with AIDS who's like, oh, I don't believe in God, you know. But you have somebody with AIDS who's like, oh, I love Jesus. As a matter of fact, I'm a pastor. And my mom and Steve did this groundbreaking interview in 1985. And allowed the church for a minute to see what AIDS was really like and that it was a human issue, that it wasn't just this gay man issue, even though this was a gay man, but this was a man who was gay, but also loved Jesus and was a pastor who was suffering from AIDS. And they got to see my mother, who was extremely touched by this and realizing, like, what have we done? We've gone wrong. We should be holding these people and loving these people, and we should be caring for each other and not ostracizing one another. The reason they did it via satellite, I found out much years later, is that my father told me this, is that they were afraid that the staff would strike and not show up to shoot the show. And they were also afraid that because they were going to put him up at the hotel, they were afraid that, forgetting words is part of dyslexia, by the way. It happens. It's also part of trauma, if you study Freud. But they were also afraid, like at the hotel, like the people at the hotel, they were just like, you know what, if he comes here, people could be awful. Because my parents knew that Christians could be awful people. And they did not want people to be awful to Steve. So they did it through via satellite. And my mom did the interview, and you can see clips of it online in places. It's been reenacted in films, movies, and plays. It's been written about. Quite an amazing moment. It's sad that it's a historic moment because it's going basically like, oh, a Christian showed compassion to another Christian with a horrible, deadly disease. When you think about the Bible and who Jesus hung out with, and then now it's in the '80s. It's a shock that Jesus hung out with lepers and people with leprosy, which was the fearful disease of the time, and touched them and just talked to them, and then here we get to this point. Oh, it's on YouTube in full length, so yeah, you guys can watch it. It's funny because the people who own all the film for all the old PTL film is the Assemblies of God. And I had to work with them for this documentary we're working on, calling them to get footage for the doc. And they're like, we don't have the one with Tammy and the homosexual. It was like really cold, and they said they didn't have it. And even in the back of my mind, I'm like, did they erase it? Or did they just get rid of it? Or did they not want it to be out there? I mean, religion can be sick. And so I'm 9 years old, but I know this is happening. I know that this interview is happening because there's a buzz around it. There's the buzz around it that it's changed because people were thinking about not showing up, because people were afraid of patients, AIDS patients, and especially gay men. They were just, at this point, everybody was terrified and afraid that they were going to get it and get the sores and go gone and have these horrific deaths that were happening. It was fear. And it's sad how we live in fear and how we create an us and them situation. We even saw it within the pandemic. It was like all of a sudden it was us and them, and it was real black and white. And we really love that black and white thinking. And that's a very dangerous way to think. And it's very harmful to people. And I think that's what I've battled most of my life with my education and thing. Like, oh, you got to learn this way and you've got to do this way. And I've had to accept myself and learn to accept myself to a point of going like, this is how I learn, this is who I am, this is how I speak. I'm not like these other speakers. I'm not like these other evangelists. I'm not like a philosopher. I just am Jay, and it's weird and it's different, but I've got to accept that who I am. So everyone was terrified in AIDS. I mean, I remember we got an invitation to see Liberace's home after he passed away, and we had thought he had passed away of AIDS at the time, and I remember going through his house, and even I was just a kid, and I was just nervous because like, oh, there's someone with AIDS that been in this house, I remember even in '95 sitting with an AIDS patient and praying with them, and they had cut their face and they were bleeding, and even I felt a little nervousness at that moment. I mean, it was just that when you lived through that time, it was quite a strange time with a lot of fear mongering, a lot of scary stuff going on. These people were the outcasts of the outcasts. My gay brothers were the outcasts of the outcasts at the time. And so when I sometimes, even to this day, when I go to LGBTQ events and I see some people be like, well, gay white males, they've got double income, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, guys, let's not forget what they went through in the 80s. And even in the 90s, really. Like, we forget that this is a group that went through huge stigma, But that's always happens when you get into this idea of the hierarchy of suffering. And the hierarchy of suffering is also this thing that kind of divides us. And as I said before, as we know, revolution is a ministry or a group of people searching and seeking grace, wanting to show grace, and to have tough conversations, and to be able to argue well, and respect and love each other. But if we forget the past, we will repeat the past, and we must not forget the past. We must not forget where these folks have come through and what they have done to be here. So Steve and my mom have this great moment, and this all happens. Now, go into the future where I become, in 2005, 2006, I become an ally to the LGBTQ community. In 2007, my mom dies. I go to a big event and I meet Steve, and I don't even realize I'm meeting Steve because in my mind, for some reason, I thought there's no way he's still alive. So I thought when I met Steve the first time that he must be somebody else that my mom interviewed at a later time. Like, I just couldn't put it together for some reason. Like, my mind just wouldn't let me grasp that Steve was still alive. And my mom had just passed away, so I think I was kind of like in a whole different zone, but it was in Arizona. And Steve was like, we met briefly. But what happened was, I was doing this, I've done this think tour with Kristen Becker called Loosen the Bible Belt. And we go around, and she's a lesbian, non-Christian person, and I'm a Christian. And then we have different comedians and musicians, and we would go around the South, and it's called Loosen the Bible Belt, and talk about why we need to be friends. Like, we don't have to believe in the same faith. We don't have to do this, but we can be unified. Or we can loosen the Bible Belt, and we can have good conversations. And we've done that for a few years. Well, we did a podcast, and Kristen got Steve on the podcast. And I'm like, he's alive? And so Kristen's like, I'm stepping back, you do the interview. And this wasn't that long ago. I mean, this was like 4 or 5 years ago, maybe even about 4 years ago. So I interviewed Steve on the podcast. And we're just automatically connected. And Steve had such an amazing life. I mean, he was a pastor. He worked at the Playboy Mansion. He worked for Playboy at one time. I mean, this guy, his life is like a trilogy, you know. And Pete came up with a good idea for a title of like a book or a movie for Steve. Is like, God Doesn't Want Me. Because Steve like went through with the AIDS, he went through all the experimental drugs. He went blind, he had cancer, he survived it all. He survived, you know, he took all these experimental medications that should have killed him. He was in a coma. He broke out in boils, sores all over his skin, and he survived. He's a miracle. I mean, they say he's a miracle. There's a word for it in the medical community. They don't call it a miracle. They call it like an oddity or something. But he is this. He was that, you know. He got COVID twice, you know, and survived. But after that interview, that me and Steve became very close. And the reason I went through all this talking about my school stuff and my learning disabilities and things like that is because there's very few people that I don't feel vulnerable around. And honestly, I don't know if I could, there's not very many people I can name. Steve was one of them. Maybe one or two other people that I maybe don't feel like I'm, and when I mean like I'm like, you know, I don't feel like I have to hold anything back or be someone else. And Steve was one of those people. I could talk to Steve about anything. There were no secrets between us. You know, I could talk about my relationships and people I was dating and my divorce and my therapy and my psychoanalysis and the film. And we got to hang out at the film premiere, but we also would, whenever I would go out to LA, we would get together and have coffee. We would get together and have, dinners together, you know, and we just became pals. And there's a lot of times where I had these like late night depressions, and we would just be on the phone for like an hour and a half, and we would just talk about it. And then there were times I would go a month and a half or two sometimes and barely say a word, just I would send him pictures of the kids. And Steve knew that I was kind of this like very introverted person. And it was just never anything I needed to worry about. You know, I never had to over-explain myself to Steve. It was just a really special time. He became like a grandfather to my kids because me and my dad were not talking at all during that time. It's really strange that we had just like have had two conversations, well, one conversation and one kind of small chat talk with my dad now. But because I have boundaries, but there's always a grace door on all my boundaries. So you can come on in if you feel like it. We figure it out, you know. But he was always there for me. And this is something that we've not talked in great depth about, but when we lost Caleb, I guess about a year and a half ago, maybe. Caleb, I'm so bad at time. one of the things that happened with Caleb was Caleb fell off the wagon and fell back into drugs. He had taken opioids for pain, and unfortunately became addicted to them when he moved out here to Seattle. Opioids and heroin and fentanyl are everywhere. Like if you see most of the homeless people in the city, they are addicted to fentanyl or opium. I mean, it's a crisis. And it kind of shows you like there's no easy answers, because it's more of a liberal city and they're more understanding with addiction and things like that, but it's still just ravaging this city, you know. And of course, you have other places that are hard on crime and it ravages the city. These are just, horrific. This type of drug addiction is horrific, and it turns people into the worst of themselves, almost turns them into something else. And so I was struggling with my relationship with Caleb because the nature of that addiction is there's a lot of lying, a lot of manipulating. We lost a lot of equipment due to the addiction, and was grateful that Steve, who was in recovery himself, was able to sponsor Caleb and help Caleb when I wasn't able to do that. And so there was a big part of that. Like I helped find Caleb a rehab here in the city, but him and Steve would talk on the phone every day, and he was really doing his best to help him. Unfortunately, after Caleb left Seattle, he passed away, and we lost Caleb. Caleb was just a genuine, loving spirit, and it's so that is another disease that addiction ravages people's lives, and so we lost another one, And I felt a lot of guilt and a lot of concern because I brought Caleb to Seattle and things like that. And Steve helped me work through that. When they had the funeral, I'm broke. I couldn't afford to fly out to the funeral and do all these things, but I was able to send flowers and do a few other things. And Steve was really just been there for me through that. And so for me, Steve is not just this miracle AIDS survivor or this really saint of the LGBTQ community or even in the Christian community in my mind, but he was my friend, and he loved my kids. I mean, just a few weeks ago before he had to go into the hospital because he had cancer and he was getting treatment for his cancer. He sent my daughter a fairy garden for her birthday, which is June 5th, and he sent it like a couple days late. He's like, "Oh, I'm the world's worst grandpa." I'm like, "No, man, it's fantastic," and sent her this fairy garden that she has over there in the sun and all this stuff. So, I mean, it's like, matter of fact, when I found out that Steve had passed away, I was sending him a picture of Minnie doing something silly. And then I got a phone call from Steve, but it was his friend Timothy saying, "Hey, Jay," because Timothy had called me to try to let me know what happened, but if I don't recognize your phone number, forgive me, I'm not going to answer the phone. So he calls me from Steve's, and, "Hey, buddy, what's up?" And he's like, "Oh, no, it's Timothy." I'm like, "Oh, yeah, man." I'm like, "How's Steve?" Because I thought maybe Steve had fallen into a coma, and he was calling me, and Timothy had been there in person. And it was unfortunate because last time I was in LA and I tried to spend some time with Steve, he got sick and got COVID again and wasn't able to be around anybody. But he said, "Steve went to be with your mother about 30 minutes ago." And it's so strange because it took me a second to really figure out what was happening there. This was literally a week ago on Saturday, this past Saturday. And it was a call with some of the family and a couple pastors, and I just bawled. I just lost it. I grieved my mom for about one day after she died, and then for 3 years I didn't grieve her. And it came back to haunt me and really affect my mental health, and I even believe my last marriage and things like that. And so I just lost it on the phone with all these people, and they were encouraging and being nice and stuff. But I'm like, here I am, like this guy who's been in ministry, been a pastor, quotes, as they used to do people used to say to me on Twitter anyway, for almost 30 years now. And I just couldn't hold myself together because he was my buddy. He was my friend. He was like an adopted dad, I loved Steve a lot. And he was like this guy who loved me unconditionally, and I didn't have to have my guard up, and I didn't have to defend my political views. I mean, I can remember like Steve would always call me after a talk and we'd talk about the talk. And sometimes he'd be like, "Are you sure the Galatians were from the Gauls, were the Gauls that you're thinking of?" And so we'd get deep dive in. And I was like, I remember like, "They are, Steve, haha," and we'd laugh about like me getting, just stuff like that. It was just like, we had great theological conversations. We had great relationship conversations. We had great conversations about sex. So it was really a cool friendship. He was really a wonderful human being, so kind, and you know, so and not unconditional love where it's like he loved me unconditionally where I could be abusive. I think sometimes that's where we make the mistakes with unconditional love. It's like, well, I just love them unconditionally so they can just hate me forever and I'm just gonna love them. I'm just gonna stay in this horrible marriage because it's unconditional. But with Steve, it was one of these things where it was just like, you're crazy, man. I'm crazy. Life is crazy. We both had wild lives and lived wild lives and seen things that most people have never seen. And it's okay. You know, it's a trip, and it's tough. And, we lost Caleb. We went through that together. We lost Caleb, and that was tough. And we still just, I don't know, went through the premiere together because it was wild. It was crazy to see all this stuff on, it was crazy to have somebody who was a part of it, and also to have Steve, who's so connected to my mom and that part of my life that I felt like it was like I still had this kind of like rope, this kind of connection. And now that's, it's mourning a lot of that. It's not just mourning Steve, but it's also mourning the connection that he had to my mom, my loving, sweet mama. We could all learn a lot from someone like Steve, and he has a book that'll come out hopefully in the next few months. And there's some other things in the work that will hopefully be coming out about Steve's life in the next months or years. He was an incredible human being and an incredible pastor and an incredible friend who went through hell and back and lived through hell and back and showed me what the essence of humanity can be. This is not a bitter person, but how you can take all this horrific hell and suffering, even in the midst of suffering. Like we would talk sometimes, and he'd be like, "Buddy, I'm just too weak to go on. Do you mind if we, put this off till later?" I'm like, "Oh, of course not." And it was really beautiful. I'm grateful that what the friendship gave us both. I'm grateful that he loved my children so much. I'm grateful that he loved me so much. And I'm really sad to have lost him. But, it's part of life. We lose people, and we have to, kind of move forward with that. And we lose people who are very, very valuable to us. It was neat because he would always remind me, he's like, you got to remember the good work you've done, for the community, for my community and things like that, and how grateful we are. And, he would say things to me that I would just sometimes forget that were part of my life and part of my, he would remind me of not just bad things, but good things, And I feel like the world is full of people who want to remind you of the bad times or the mistakes or why your family's this or that, and it just wasn't that way with him. He even had, compassion towards my father and would try to help me understand what he was as a man and why his life was probably the way it was and why he was treating me the way he was. And it wasn't one of those things where it was like he was trying to fix it. It's just we were throwing things out there, trying to figure things out. And that's a beautiful friendship to have. And I will miss my family, Steve, my friend Steve, and I'll miss the humanity that we were able to share together. You know, he was there during heartbreak. He was there during loss and death, and there during just a lot of weird stuff. And I'm grateful that he was there and the timing that he came back into my life. I don't feel God very much, to be honest with you, but it really was one of those things where us being together, it felt like there was some sort of higher power at work. Not to say that I don't really believe in an interventional God, because I can't explain suffering, but there was still a lot of suffering, but somehow our lives worked out. And maybe it was just my mom brought us together through history and time. But I'm grateful for that. Anyway, thanks for listening. I hope that made sense, because what I wanted to really put through is that all that feelings of not adding up, of not being good enough or smart enough or thinking all these awful things, I still feel that lots of times. I still feel that with so many people in my life and people I work with. I still feel it when I'm preparing to talk on Sunday. But the point is with someone like Steve, I didn't feel it. With someone like Steve, it just didn't matter. And how great is that? And to know it, it might not matter to a lot of people, but to have made clear to you that, like, you're doing great work and overcoming all of that. You've overcome all that bullshit. And he goes, more about, he's like, look at what you know about Galatians. He's like, I didn't know that. I was questioning you and you were right. Like this constant, like there was a lot of affirmation as well. And it's really cool to have somebody with degrees and things like that, supporting you, loving you, caring about you, and encouraging you, and being in your corner. And he really was. Zoe was another one of those people who's just really encouraging. I'm usually not really good around encouraging people, to be honest with you. I don't take compliments very well. It takes like a really weird person to be able to encourage me, unfortunately, because it's just my mental health status. I have self-doubt and depression a lot. So well done, Steve. You lived an amazing life, man. You touched so many people's lives. I don't think my mom would be celebrated as she is today had you two's paths not crossed. And I'm so grateful for that moment and everything it did. And in that moment in 1985, as like a 9-year-old kid, realizing by that very act of my mom doing that interview and it happening at that place, realizing that there is a love that is beyond fear. There is a love that is beyond telling other people what they can do or can't do, what's right or wrong, that there is a love that surpasses all that. A love that passes all like human understanding of, well, you can't do that because you two aren't supposed to talk. You're supposed to say this is a curse. You're not supposed to show compassion. And to see that was a big part of me and my 9-year-old brain, something kicking, going like, if I ever go into this is part of it. It's kicking against the pricks. It's not having the rules and the regulations and the dogma to get in the way there. That love is always the main thing, that grace is going to be the ultimate concern. And the grace and love are the ultimate concerns. And knowing that at 9 years old, because Steve and my mom came together and had a conversation on television, so that was such a big part of my life. Like, it developed who I was. That's probably why I've done what I've done and gone away. All that, and of course, the prison and all the other stuff. But it's just things, steps built in your life. So I'm so grateful for that. So he has a freaking amazing legacy, and I'm glad to be part of that legacy. As far as his funeral, I know we are talking right now that he's about something in a few weeks in LA, and then a couple other cities where there'll be memorial services. I will post it on all my social media once I know what the plan is for his services, and keep you all in that loop. So I would just like to say thank you all for sticking with us through this, and I'm glad that Steve has been a part of this community. He's been a leader in this community, and he's spoken in this community. And if you go on to I'm sure Facebook, or you go on to our Spotify or our Apple stuff or our iTunes, you can listen to talks that he gave at Revolution as well. and celebrate his work and his life and his legacy. Because, to have that type of faith, his faith was definitely stronger than mine, and he's been through way more than me, and a lot scarier stuff of just feeling the fragility of humanity, of life. So thanks, everybody. Hey, if you like what we're doing, he would always push me to raise money. So he would always say, Jay, you got to raise money. Don't forget to raise money. He would actually put the link up sometimes for the donation page because he wanted to make sure that Revolution could survive. So you can go to revolutionchurch.com. We have Venmo now, finally, and we have PayPal. You can do monthly donations. You can give one giant thing. You can call your millionaire friend and say, hey, give them $1 million so they can just talk and not have to worry about this stuff. So in honor of Steve, there I go. Please support Revolution financially. We need your help. So I will say it clearly this time. We need your help. We need your support to continue this work and to pay the people we do, to make sure that all our finances are in the right line and do all this stuff. And if we ever want to grow and get beyond where we're at right now, we've been ups and downs. If we want to continue to evolve and move and change shapes as Revolution does, we need your support now more than ever. I know it's tough for everybody out there, but I want to do that. You can also retweet these things, share them in your stories, share them on your Instagram, share them on your Facebook, share them on your Twitter, share them on your thread, share them on all that, where all of our overlords rule us, and share them there, and we will maybe have a little bit of fighting the system within those systems. All right. Love you so much. Have a great week. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed this podcast. To make your 100% tax-deductible donation today, please visit revolutionchurch.com/donate. You can also learn more by clicking the donate section on the website.